Was there ever a time in your life when someone called you weird? Or have you ever known someone that you thought was weird? Well, in the case of one young boy, he was in the unique position of being able to say yes to both those questions. Boris was 9 years old, about to turn 10 actually, and was a kid just like any other. Or at least he wished he was. Because you see, most children have at least one person they can call their friend. The lucky ones have a plethora of people they can play with and share secrets with or rely on when life dumps a bucket of lemons in their laps. But unfortunately for Boris, his social life was about as silent as a library, and frankly, he would have gladly hung out with the books if novels could talk. But stories, when read alone, tend to be a one-sided conversation. As such, Boris had no one he could call a true blue friend. It wasn't for lack of trying, it was more like the universe bestowed upon him all the qualities that mark someone as uncool in the eyes of everyone else who seemed to come equipped with bug-catching nets for how much they were social butterflies compared to him. Which, speaking of insects, that was one thing that filled him with the utmost dread. Plenty of folks had an aversion to spiders, but Boris's trepidation over anything creepy-crawly reached levels his classmates found hilariously ridiculous. Beetles, worms, ants, bumblebees, even butterflies and ladybugs. It didn't matter. The mere sight of anything remotely bug-like sent him screaming and sent all the other kids into giggle fits. The only thing that made everyone laugh harder was Boris's special talent. His grandpa, whom he dearly loved, had taught him how to play a unique instrument, a fact he was eager to share at his school's talent show. He was certain this would help redeem his reputation of being seen as the fourth-grade fraidy cat. Boris's hopes were dashed the moment he walked on stage with his black hard-shell carrying case and clicked it open, revealing a small piano attached to a strange spring-like squeeze box. It was an accordion. He proudly showed off his long-practiced skills as his fingers danced across the keys and he squeezed and stretched the bellows. But his smile faded upon gazing out at the audience filled with unimpressed frowns, yawning, and gossipy whispers. He realized too late that his classmates didn't exactly appreciate melodies filled with horns and honking best suited for a polka. They all politely clapped, only to later reveal what they truly thought of his performance the moment the teachers were distracted. In their eyes, real rock stars played cool instruments, like the guitar or the drums. Marching bands had flutes and tubas and trumpets. Fancy opera halls had cellos and violins and harps. Country music had the fiddle. But the accordion? Who would ever pick that weird thing to play? "A dweeb, that's who," said a boy from his math class. "Yeah, why you gotta be such a dork about everything?" asked a girl who wasn't thrilled about being Boris's assigned science lab partner. "Because he's too afraid to do anything exciting," another kid taunted. "Might as well call him Boring Boris." Faster than a spreading germ, the awful nickname took hold and spread amongst the student body until eventually the accordion-playing, insect-fearing boy couldn't go one day without hearing jeers and whispers of "Boring Boris" at least once. He soon resigned himself to the belief that he was doomed to be all alone forever. It came as a bit of a relief when Boris's parents announced they were moving away to a different town. While many children struggle with having to leave much of what they love behind, Boris took the news gratefully. Since he had no real friends to speak of, he hadn't much in the ways of people or things to miss, and his parents, using that mysterious, insightful gift most parents seem to have, must have sensed his thoughts, for they tried to assure him that things would be better in their new town. They told him to see the move as a fresh start. Boris did his best to remain optimistic, but wasn't prepared for how awkward it can be to start all over again. The day after they arrived in their new neighborhood, Boris's folks sent him off to go play while they organized the house, told him to introduce himself to the children who lived nearby. But trying to make new friends can be nerve-wracking when you're haunted by all the taunts that came before, and it left Boris wondering if these new kids would treat him just the same. When he came across a group of boys and girls playing tag, he remained frozen froze into the spot, and all his vocabulary took a vacation. He merely watched from a distance before heaving a defeated sigh and heading home, not wanting to risk embarrassing himself. There was no doubt in Boris's mind that most, if not all, those kids attended the school he'd be going to in a few days, so he knew he couldn't avoid talking to people forever. But whatever words he rehearsed in his head just didn't sound good enough, or interesting enough, or clever and witty enough. Maybe his old classmates were right. Maybe he was super boring. And experience taught him that no one wants to hang out with people who are boring. That night, as he tucked himself in bed and shut his eyes, he made a single wish. From somewhere in the depths of his lonesome heart, his only desire turned into words that bubbled to the surface, and he muttered aloud, "I wish I had a friend. Just one friend who will like me and not make fun of me, even if I'm boring." The next morning, his wish had drifted to the back of his mind as he had a more pressing matter to deal with. Over time, the keys on Boris's accordion had begun to stick, and his parents were so busy with the move that they had no opportunity to take their son to get his beloved instrument fixed. Thankfully, Boris did have one stroke of luck while exploring the shops all around the square near his new house. This town not only had a music store, but it was within walking distance. And so, after promising his folks he'd only talk to shopkeepers and other kids and would look both ways before crossing any roads, Boris grabbed his allowance money and brought his accordion to the music store. The repairman, who appeared to be as old as Boris's grandpa, was kind and skilled enough to fix the problem, and soon after, Boris found himself sitting on the bench outside the shop, testing out his new and improved instrument. He would have liked to have gone straight home, but teams of movers were still delivering his family's belongings to the new house, and he didn't want to be in the way. And more than that, he missed making music. It reminded him of all the good times with his grandpa. As he tickled the keys and pressed the bellows, his eyes slid shut, and he played whatever random melodies came to mind. And for just a moment, he didn't think about school, or his lackluster social life, or anything really. He just took comfort in doing something he liked with no one around to judge. Or so he thought. The next time there was a pause between tunes, there came the sound of someone excitedly clapping, and Boris's eyes snapped open as he gasped. Just a few feet away was a girl around the same age as him. She had long red hair that was borderline orange like a pumpkin, and sky blue eyes that stared at him as though she just witnessed something magical. But the most striking thing about her was her outfit. If a rainbow could descend from the sky and take human form, she would have been the result. From her shirt to her shoes to the patches on her overalls to all the buttons and keychains on her purse to her jewelry, every color one could think of had equal representation. Even the couple band-aids on her fingers and elbows weren't spared from the color explosion, a sign of someone who went on adventures and had the marks to prove it. She sat upon an equally vivid bike that was clearly hand-painted with every shade between red and violet and covered in glittery heart, flower, and smiley face stickers. Pastel streamers adorned the handlebars and blew in the breeze. It even had a bell, horn, and basket. She gave Boris an ear-to-ear grin, exposing a gap in her smile. Evidently the tooth fairy recently paid her a visit. Boris, meanwhile, couldn't help his shock. So engrossed was he in his music making, he had no clue he was being watched. How long had she been standing there? All at once, the real world came crashing back on him like a tidal wave, and his mouth fumbled for words. His heart hit his stomach the way a balloon filled with lead would sink, and he braced himself for the inevitable teasing to start. The mystery girl bounced up and down on her bicycle seat as though all her energy were ready to burst out, and she exclaimed, "That was awesome!" Well, that was the last reaction Boris expected. Thrown for a loop, all he could sputter out was, thanks? "What song was that?" she asked. "It made me feel like I was in France, or Germany, maybe Italy too." Wow, no one ever said that about his music before. Boris rubbed the back of his neck as he tried to explain. Well, I know just a couple, but I was just kinda making stuff up." "You make up your own stuff too?" the redhead gasped. "That's amazing!" "Really?" Boris hoped she wasn't playing a joke on him. "Yeah," she nodded. "The accordion can be like super duper hard to play. You must be really smart. Of course, anyone who plays an instrument is probably pretty smart, but like, you don't see the accordion that much, you know?" She was talking a mile a minute at that point. All the while, Boris contemplated her words. He never realized he'd been playing an instrument that was considered tricky. There were plenty of times he messed up a note, but he never found it impossible. Of course, he practiced a lot too. It was one thing for his family to compliment him. They knew him and loved him. It was another thing entirely when a stranger said he had talent. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Boris's heart swelled a little with pride, and his cheeks turned as red as a tomato. Hoping he wasn't about to ruin this lovely moment, he spoke in a tiny voice. "You don't think it's weird?" "Well, sure it's weird, but since when is weird a bad thing?" The mystery girl smiled and shrugged. "Weird is interesting. Weird is unique. Weird is fun." "Weird is what gets you laughed at," Boris thought to himself. Before he could say as much, the redhead went on to say, "You're just like Weird Al Yankovic." Boris raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Weird Al," she explained. "He's only the most famous, funniest, greatest accordion player ever. My grandma's got all his CDs and stuff." "Wow," Boris sighed with awe. All his old teachers taught him about composers like Mozart and Beethoven. He had no idea there was someone famous for playing an odd instrument like his, much less someone who wanted to be called weird, so much that they'd make it part of their name. Speaking of which, the mystery girl suddenly asked, "Anyway, I haven't seen you around here before. What's your name?" "Me? Boris almost didn't want to say. All the kids at his previous school believed his name made him sound old. "Only grandmas and grandpas are called that," they teased. He briefly considered lying to her, but thought better of it. First impressions are important, and while his name may have been unconventional, being untruthful would be far worse. He partially hid behind his accordion as he muttered, I'm Boris." "Boring, Boris," the old taunts echoed in his mind. He clenched up and prepared for the laughing to start. Instead, the rainbow girl gasped, "Boris? Neato! The only other Boris I know is Boris Karloff." Up went Boris's eyebrow for the second time in a row. "Who's that?" "An actor," she said with a barely contained feverishness. "He did the Grinch's voice in How the Grinch Stole Christmas. And he played the monster in the Frankenstein movie," she quickly corrected. "Well, there's been like a bunch of Frankenstein movies, but I mean like the super old black and white one, the best one. Or at least I think it's the best one. Everybody who plays the monster copies off of Boris Karloff, probably because he was so good at it. Did your parents like him? Is that why they named you that? If they did, that's so cool." There she went rambling again. As she let out all the thoughts her brain couldn't contain, Boris just sat there astonished. First he shared an instrument with a famous musician. Now he found out he shared a name with a famous actor, someone who voiced the Grinch, one of the best Christmas cartoons ever. He couldn't believe it. Maybe his name wasn't so silly after all. It was then he knew what movie she was referring to. He never seen it the whole way through, but the memory of his grandpa sitting in front of the TV flashed in his mind, and he remembered the striking image of the monster with his flat head and neck bolts being chased through the mountains by an angry mob with torches. He never really gave thought to who any of the actors were until now, but to discover he had the same name as the person who brought two of the world's most prominent characters to life gave him a sense of delight he never experienced before. But most striking of all was that last word she said. Cool. She called him cool? She thought she was cool? No one had ever said he was cool before, not once in his life. Wasn't he supposed to be boring Boris? He never imagined he could ever be seen as cool to anyone. His thoughts were broken when the redhead announced, "Oh, I almost forgot. I play an instrument too. I could show you if you want. Are you doing anything tomorrow?" Not really, no," Boris shrugged. He was pretty much abiding by the whims of whatever the day brought him ever since he moved in. His folks let him do anything he wanted, more or less, as long as he got all his chores done. "Want to meet here at the music store?" she asked. "Okay," Boris nodded. "Is after lunch good?" "Sounds great." She winked and flashed him the two-fingered peace sign. "Groovy. See you then." Groovy? The only time he heard that word was in old episodes of Scooby-Doo. Quick as a flash, the girl fully hopped back on the seat of her bike, honked the horn, and took off down the sidewalk, ringing the bell the whole time. Boris watched the cavalcade of colors speed away, having never expected to make a friend, much less a play date, when he woke up that morning. And only then did he realize he had no clue who this girl even was. Momentarily abandoning his accordion on the bench, he jogged off after the redhead, whose hair blew in the wind like Superman's cape. He yelled at the top of his lungs, "Wait, I never got your name!" Before she disappeared from sight completely, she called over her shoulder, "It's Rini! Rini Boe!" Needless to say, Boris's parents were delighted upon hearing about their son's encounter with the walking, talking color prism. They were more than happy to let him go play and take a break from his chores since the rest of his time was being eaten up by the big move. And so, the next day, the moment he finished his lunch, Boris gathered up his accordion case and raced over to the music store. Seeing no sign of Rini, he figured he'd gotten there early, so he took a moment to head inside and ask the shopkeeper about Weird Al Yankovic. The old gentleman chuckled and said he was surprised that Boris didn't ask about the famed musician sooner, considering what instrument he played. 15 minutes later, Boris left the store, having spent the rest of his allowance money to buy one of Weird Al's CDs. Now all he had to do was wait for Rini. He plopped himself down on the bench outside the store, in the same spot as the day before, and cracked open his accordion case. In a few seconds, he had a tune going, and he played whatever melody came to mind to help pass the time. However, as the minutes ticked by, Boris grew increasingly anxious. Rini had descended upon him like such a whirlwind that they hadn't exactly made a solid plan of when precisely to meet or what they'd be doing. What if she didn't show up? What if she forgot all about him? What if her parents said no, or she got tied up with anything? Or worst of all, what if she purposely ditched him and this was all one big prank? A way to make fun of the clueless new kid. He bit his lip to keep his lunch from coming back up his throat at the sickening thought. A thought that was broken by the honking of a horn and the ringing of a bell. Boris glanced up at the sound, and to his utter relief, he watched as Rini came pedaling towards him on her colorful bike. She was dressed just as vividly as the day before, and as she drew nearer, he took notice of something sticking out of her bike's front basket. Some kind of box with two rods sticking out of it. "Hi, Boris," Rini called with a smile. "Didn't leave you waiting too long, did I?" "Oh no, you're fine. I just practiced in the meantime is all." Boris pointed at his accordion for emphasis. He truly didn't mind having to be patient. He was just happy she kept her promise. "Awesome, we could jam together then." Rini clapped with excitement. "Got my theremin all ready to go." "Your what?" Boris asked. "My theremin." Rini flicked the kickstand down before hopping off her bike and reaching into the basket. What she pulled out was unlike anything Boris had ever seen before in terms of instruments, if that's even what it was. It appeared to be a foot-long cherry red radio with a couple of knobs and dials and two metal rods jutting out of the top like an antenna, with a third sticking out of its side. Boris tilted his head in confusion at his new friend. What does it do?" "Just watch." Rini sat down next to him on the bench before placing the box in her lap and adjusting the dials. When it seemed she had everything set just the way she wanted, she began waving her hands back and forth and up and down like a conductor for an orchestra. But there weren't any strings to pluck, and not once did she touch the antenna rods. And yet somehow, from out of thin air, a series of tones burst forth from the box's built-in speakers. As she dipped her fingers and brought them back up, the noises lowered and rose in pitch, akin to a singer practicing their chords. The odd melody made Boris imagine aliens landing in flying saucers. "How are you doing that?" Boris wondered aloud. "My mom tried explaining it to me once." Rini's tongue stuck out a bit as she concentrated on her playing. "These sticks send out radio waves, I think, and when you move your hands close or far away from them, it changes the notes. Want to try it?" "Okay." Boris set down his accordion so Rini could slide the theremin over to him. The moment it was in his lap, he began experimenting, moving his hands every which way. It amazed him how music could be made without even having to touch anything. It was almost like magic. The more he listened, the more he realized what these sounds reminded him of. "I think I've heard this before, like in TV and movies whenever there's haunted houses and ghosts and spooky stuff going on. I didn't know it was this thing that made all those noises." "I know, isn't it cool?" Rini bounced in her seat. "Uh-huh," Boris nodded. He then wondered how anyone at his old school could believe the accordion to be a weird instrument. They clearly never heard of the theremin before. He passed the box back to her. "Where did you get it?" "A ghost gave it to me." Rini started up another eerie tune. It took a moment for Boris to process what she said before he did a double take. "A what?" There was an old house that was getting cleaned out near where I used to live. I found this in the trash. The ghost who lived there was super sad it was being thrown out, so he let me have it." She spoke as though she were talking about the weather. Boris blinked at her, waiting for her to laugh and say she was joking. When nothing of the sort happened, he dared to say, "Are you serious?" "Yeah, why wouldn't I be?" She continued waving her hands over the antenna but turned her head to face him. "Do you know if there's any haunted houses around here? I haven't explored one in a long time." Was this girl for real? There's no way she actually met a ghost, Boris thought. He stopped believing in such things ages ago. Now bugs, on the other hand, bugs were icky and gross and most importantly real. That was something to be afraid of. She had to be pranking him. But what if she wasn't, though? He may not have believed in ghosts, but what if she did? She looked at him with the utmost sincerity, and he didn't want to risk losing his potential first friend. Boris finally carefully answered, Not that I know of. I kinda just moved here, and if ghosts are real, why would you want to go in a haunted house?" "Because it's exciting, duh. All ghosts were people at one point, and they probably got all kinds of stories to tell. Some want to be left alone, but most of them are just lonely, I think. Everyone gets scared of them just because they're a little spooky, but I think they're neat." Rini let out a sigh as she stared into the distance, lost in thought. Who wouldn't want to be friends with a ghost? This was the most calm and serious Boris had seen her act. It made him think back on his old school, how the teasing got to be so unbearable that he'd stopped trying to talk to anyone in fear of what they'd say or do to him. He pretty much became a ghost in a way, silently drifting through the halls wishing he were invisible. He was left to ponder then why Rini seemed to like him so much, but was nonetheless thankful to finally have a friend. He certainly liked her. She gave off an air of shameless self-confidence that was both admirable and infectious. Rini broke the quiet when she suddenly asked, "So anyway, how'd you get your accordion?" Boris was momentarily thrown at how quickly her energy came back. He began pumping the bellows on his instrument in time to whatever melody she was making up on her theremin. It was definitely an odd combination. He simply replied, "It was my grandpa's. He taught me how to play." "Aw, that's nice. So he's always with you then." Rini played with a renewed vigor. "Gifts that are passed down like that are the best. Then that person's never totally gone." "Like your ghost friend?" Boris asked. "Yep," Rini nodded. He was still skeptical about this whole ghost business, but she did make a good point. Whenever he mentioned his grandpa, most people would get uncomfortable and say they were sorry. Rini was the first to not immediately sound sad about it. On the contrary, she seemed to treat it as just the way of things, as though she knew that a person could still impact your life even when they weren't around. It made him wonder if she had anyone she missed. And then he realized he knew next to nothing about her. Boris paused in his accordion playing to ask, "So, what school do you go to?" "My house is my school," she said as she focused on trying to get a certain tone on her theremin to come out right. "Pretty much the whole world is my school. You can learn anything anywhere." Oh, she was homeschooled. Boris stared down at his shoes, unable to hide his disappointment. "Oh, I was hoping we'd be in the same class." "It's no biggie. We can hang out any other time," Rini replied, ever the positive one. And Boris had to admit she wasn't wrong. He was about to say as much when she blurted out rapid fire. "What about you? What grade are you in? What's your favorite color? What's your favorite animal? You like drawing?" She spouted off the questions so fast he had to take a second to catch up. Let's see. 4th grade, gonna start 5th grade soon. Penguins, and yeah, I like drawing." Rini giggled. "Your favorite color is penguin?" "Huh? Oh no, it's green." Boris scrambled to correct himself. She let out a laugh, clearly teasing him a little, but in the fun, nice way, not a mean way. She said in a sing-song tone, "Cool. Love in green is perfectly keen." It sounded like she was trying to come up with a rhyme to go with the melody they were playing, judging by the random words she mumbled to herself. Boris gave her a moment, then asked, "What about you?" "What about what now?" She didn't pause in her song-making attempts. "What's your favorite color?" He was honestly curious, considering her determination to wear every shade the human eye could see. Rini finally paused to think it over, and the silence that followed left him in suspense. She hummed a little as she contemplated what should have been a fairly easy question before shouting, "All of them." Boris nearly shook his head. Why was he not surprised? She went on to say, "Each one of them is special. I couldn't settle on one, so I wear them all." Boris couldn't imagine ever being that bold, but nodded along. Makes sense, I guess. That's why rainbows are the best, because they got all the colors, Rini explained with a barely contained energy. And they don't come around a lot, which makes them extra special. You know you're gonna have a good day when you see one. So that's why I wear them, so every day will be a nice one. Once again, Boris was amazed at her thoughtfulness. He never really reflected on why he liked green the most. He just did. He supposed he always found it a calming, nice color. Same with his accordion. He played it because it made him feel close to his grandpa. But also, he just liked how it sounded to begin with, which is what led to his grandpa teaching him how to work it. He never thought too hard on why the accordion appealed to him. It just did. Did anyone need a complicated reason for liking something? Boris wished he could take Rini and her mindfulness and positivity with him to his new school. His stomach clenched at the reminder and he muttered, "Hope I have that kind of luck. School starts in 3 days and I don't know anyone there." "So?" Rini shrugged. "Going to new places, meeting new people. That's always exciting. More chances to make new friends." Easy for her to say. She had such a cheerful attitude she probably made friends every waking second. Boris was about to ask if anyone ever made fun of her, but was stopped by her turning off her theremin and hopping off the bench. After placing it back in her bike's basket, she stretched her limbs, then turned to him. "Anyway, it was fun jamming with you, but I gotta bounce. You want to go on an adventure tomorrow? I think there's a park near here and I want to check it out. You want to come with?" Boris hadn't realized how much time had passed. Best to get home before his parents started worrying, but if exploring his new town meant getting to hang out with her more, he was eager to say yes, and he found himself nodding. "Sure. Should I bring my accordion again?" "You don't have to if you don't want to. I'm keeping my theremin at home," she grinned and winked, "but I will bring a special surprise." Now Boris was really curious. "Really? Does 1 o'clock sound okay?" "Sounds great," Rini pumped her fist. "I'll meet you at this bench. Later, Gator." With that, Rini jumped aboard her rainbow-coated ride and pedaled away, Boris waving goodbye all the while. As he packed up his accordion and set off for home, he reflected on the fun afternoon he had. While he was still nervous about starting his new school, he was at least relieved to already have one neighborhood friend he could look forward to seeing each day, as odd as she was. The next day, Boris got up early to make sure all his chores were done by lunchtime, and lucky for him, in the midst of his belongings being unpacked, his bike had been uncovered. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. If he and his new companion were going to be gallivanting about town, he felt it wise to match her transportation. No one wants to awkwardly jog next to someone on wheels. Boris's bike was a simple olive green with no basket or horn or streamers, but he did have a bell and reflectors on the wheel spokes. It may not have been as impressive as Rini's rainbow-coated ride, but he figured no one would be able to match her eccentric taste. And so, Boris pedaled on over to that fateful bench once again. Funny how the music store was turning into their designated meetup spot. He arrived at precisely 1 o'clock to find Rini waiting for him this time, decked out in every color known to mankind as usual. Rather than the bench, she sat atop her fantastical bike, bobbing her head to a beat only she could hear. He rang his own bike's bell to get her attention, and she excitedly waved to him. "Hi, Boris," she called out. "Hey, Rini," he said. "Guess what? I got a Weird Al CD and listened to it last night. It was pretty good." "See, I told you he was awesome," Rini exclaimed. "Which song's your favorite?" "I always like My Baloney. I sing it whenever I make sandwiches." Boris gave it some thought, then decided, probably Ode to a Superhero. The stuff he sang about Spider-Man was pretty funny, but true. I didn't know anyone could even make songs like that. "Oh yeah, you can make a song about anything," Rini nodded. "Wait till you hear the one he did about fast food." Boris was about to ask the name of the song when suddenly another voice answered, "Brah, trapped in the drive-thru, brah!" Rini glanced downward and laughed. "Hey, that's what I was gonna say." It was then that Boris was able to see that Rini hadn't come alone this time. Sitting inside her bike's basket was a bird, but not just any bird. It was a parrot, an honest-to-goodness parrot. Boris only ever saw them in zoos and on rare occasions a pet shop here or there. To see one casually hanging out on this girl's bike, wearing a harness and tied to the handlebars on a sizable leash, was beyond surreal. Boris blinked in astonishment. Is that a parrot?" Yippers! He's the big surprise I told you about. He may not be a penguin, but he is a bird. Rini petted her avian friend on the head. Meet Motley. Motley, my name's Motley. Motley the parrot. Rah! The bird bobbed his head and chirped. Boris was even more impressed. Wow, he could talk? Oh yeah, parrots are super smart. He knows all kinds of words, and they're super colorful. That's why they're my favorite animal, Rini smiled. By then, Motley had jumped up onto her shoulder and began preening himself. Rah! Favorite animal, super colorful. Rah! Judging by his bright red feathers that faded into blues, greens, and yellows towards his tail, it was easy to see why his owner loved him so much. Boris had to ask, "Where did you get him?" "My dad found him on one of his expeditions, or more like Motley found us. He flew into our camp one day and wouldn't leave, so he wound up coming with us," Rini explained as she scratched the bird under his beak. "I take him for walks like this so he can fly around for a while." Case in point, the parrot leapt off her shoulder and circled around in the air, the leash stretching so he could explore without fluttering too far away. All the while he cawed, "Make a friend! See you! I see you! Brah!" Boris just stared in awe, having never expected to see something like this when he woke up that morning. Seeing a tropical animal in his neighborhood and talking, no less. It was just as incredible as penguins swimming rather than flying, which is what made him love those birds as equally. Rini broke his chain of thought when she voiced an idea. "Hey, Motley's got pretty good eyes, and I know he knows what a playground is. Maybe he can help us find the park." At that point, Boris wouldn't have been surprised if the bird could tap dance. He recalled a group of kids he couldn't work up the nerve to talk to when he first came to town, and he pointed down the road. "I think I saw some kids down that-a-way a couple days ago." "Cool, we'll start there then." Rini clicked her tongue and gently tugged on the leash. "Come on, Motley, let's go find a place to play." "Rah, place to play, place to play." The polychrome parrot whistled and swooped over their heads. They made an odd sight, that much was certain, but Rini, per usual, didn't appear to have a care in the world as she boldly pedaled along the sidewalk, humming to herself. Motley glided a little ways ahead of her, but never so far that he'd have to pull on the leash like an airborne puppy. Boris rode alongside her, taking note of where they were going so he'd know for next time. He was concentrating on memorizing the landmarks so much he almost didn't catch Rini's question. "So, do you have a pet?" "Huh? Oh, no, not yet anyway." Boris sighed and hung his head. "I'd like one, but I don't know if I can. My dad's got allergies." "Aw, don't give up. There's tons of animals that don't make people sneeze." She glanced at him with full certainty. "I'm sure you'll find the right one." Boris wished he could believe her, as a pet was one of the few things he constantly asked his parents for to combat his loneliness, but he wasn't about to get his hopes up. The mention of his dad then made him ponder what her family was possibly like if they let her dress so loudly and kept parrots for companionship. He then remembered something she said earlier and spoke up. "So, your bird, you said you got him while camping?" Rini nodded. "My dad's expedition, yeah." He tested out the unfamiliar word. "Expedition?" "Fancy word for adventure, but like the one that people send you on to research stuff," she clarified. "My dad's an archaeologist." Now that word he knew. His eyes went wide. "Like finding dinosaur bones and stuff?" "Sometimes, yeah," she said. "Is he doing that right now?" he eagerly asked. "Nah, he's teaching classes here," she shook her head. "We live up the road, at least for now. We're always going on adventures, so we don't stay in one place for too long." Every time Boris thought he was finally beginning to figure this girl out, she spout off another bizarre tidbit that leave him even further befuddled. Never in his life did he think he'd ever meet a kid so weird, but the interesting and fun kind of weird. And what did she mean by living up the road? Where up the road? His musings were interrupted by Motley calling from above. "Brah, adventure, playground, brah, I see you, brah." True to the bird's word, just across the street corner was on a grassy area with a grove of trees. In the distance, they spotted what looked like a slide, a jungle gym, and some swings. Rini let out a delighted gasp. "You found it, Motley! Great job!" She then turned to Boris. "Good idea on going this way. You'd make a great detective." Boris's cheeks turned pink at the compliment. No one had ever said such a thing about him before. After carefully crossing the road, the duo parked their bikes by the trees, to which Motley circled in for for a landing and settled into Rini's basket. There were a few grown-ups walking around with baby strollers or their dogs, but otherwise Rini and Boris had the park to themselves. They wasted no time in racing down the slide and climbing to and fro on the monkey bars. The entire time, Boris rambled off a slew of questions about her dad and what artifacts he found, if any. Rini just laughed and said it was mostly pottery and jewelry, but he did uncover a raptor claw once. Eventually, the two moved on to the swing set. It was immediately apparent that Rini wanted to soar as high as she possibly could. Normally, Boris would have kept a comfortable, relaxing pace, but his new friend's enthusiasm inspired him to be more daring than usual. They pumped their legs hard and fast, taking longer and longer to touch the ground with each swing. As he made his highest arc yet, Boris called out, "I feel like we're about to blast off." "Just like my mom does," Rini exclaimed. "Let's see if we can touch the sun." "Like your mom does?" Boris asked, now puzzled. "Yeah," Rini shouted back. "She's an astronaut." He thought he almost didn't hear her right, but when her statement clicked in his brain, he put both his feet down and came to a screeching halt. The dust cloud he kicked up caused him to cough and hack. "An astronaut?" His odd friend kept on swinging as though she didn't just say the most absurd thing he'd ever heard. "Uh-huh. She's up on the space station right now. She said if I get good grades, she'll bring back a piece of moon rock for me." Boris shook his head in disbelief. There was no way both of her parents could be so unconventional. He could buy the stuff about her dad, but her mom having an even bigger mind-blowing career? This had to be a joke. Motley was obviously real, but maybe her folks just bought him at a pet store. Maybe they were just normal teachers and she was afraid he wouldn't like her, so she over-exaggerated what they actually did. Yeah, that had to be it. But regardless of what fable she may have been spinning, she'd been nothing but kind to him since the day they met. He decided to just play along for the moment, as he didn't want to risk upsetting her and lose the first friend he ever made. Rini let out a delighted squeal as she pumped one last swing, then launched herself off the seat. She went flying through the air and landed a few feet away, bending her knees to absorb the shock of the jump. She then popped back up and posed the way an Olympic gymnast would after a routine and cheered, "The eagle has landed!" Boris swallowed a gasp. Swinging higher than he ever did before was one thing, but pulling daring stunts like that is where he drew the line. Rini glanced around, then pointed to something she spotted. "Hey Boris, this park's got a sandbox. You want to look for buried treasure?" He shrugged. Sure." She pumped a fist as she hissed, "Yes!" before sprinting over to the sandpit. Boris had a dash to catch up to her, and after they each picked their respective corners, they began digging. As the minutes ticked by, they mainly came across paper clips and a pair of broken sunglasses. But Boris did manage to score a quarter, and Rini cheered upon uncovering a bottle cap. She shoved it in her pocket so she could later figure out how old it was. They talked about whatever randomly came to mind in between their tiny discoveries. At one point, Rini asked, "Do you have a mom or dad?" "I do." Boris scooped another handful of sand off to the side. "So what do your parents do?" She added a hairpin to her pile of findings. He was more than a bit nervous to say, considering how amazing her family was, or at least she made them sound cool. By then, the hole he created touched the bottom of the box, yet he busied himself with trying to dig further. Anything to avoid looking at her and see her disappointed face when he confessed. "Well, my dad just got a job at a movie theater, and my mom's a librarian." He braced himself for an expected bored sigh, but instead got an intrigued, "That's pretty neat." Boris worked up the nerve to finally glance at her. "Really?" "Yeah," Rini smiled as she filled in her own hole, having also touched bottom. "Your dad gets to watch all kinds of movies all the time, and your mom gets to find awesome stories for people to read, like a treasure hunt." He considered her words for a moment. "Huh, I never thought of it that way." "Any job's pretty fun if you make it fun," she said simply. "It's all in how you look at things." Boris was once again impressed by Rini's unabashed joy for practically anything and everything. He wished more of his classmates at his old school could have been like her. Then perhaps he wouldn't have been so set in his belief that he led a boring life. Or maybe he did, and he was only now learning that if he yearned for excitement, he'd have to seek it out rather than wait for things to happen. So caught up was he in his musings, he almost didn't notice a tiny screeching sound near his feet. But when he did, every hair on his body stood on end, and he prayed he didn't just hear what he thought he heard. Slowly his eyes fell downward, and his worst fears were confirmed. An icky, ugly green grasshopper the size of his thumb had perched itself on the toe of his shoe. Its legs and wings twitched and vibrated, creating that all too familiar chirping most people heard on lazy summer evenings. Boris had to summon all of his willpower to not begin crying right then and there. The day was going so well. Why did this disgusting thing have to show up? And on him, no less. If he could just kick his foot fast enough, maybe he could flick it away and have time to run for the hills. He never got the chance, for Rini spotted the ghastly creature and let loose an elated gasp. "Aw, a grasshopper! He's so cute!" And then, to his utter horror, she leaned over, reached out, and picked up the bug, cradling it in her palm and petting it like one would a dog or cat. She made kissing noises and cooed, "Oh, he's even your favorite color, Boris. Let's go get some water from the water fountain to wet the sand and build a castle for him." She finally looked up at her friend and noticed him shaking and breathing heavily as though he just ran a marathon race. For the first time ever, she did something he thought she wasn't capable of. She frowned at him. "What's the matter, Boris?" To him, her voice sounded a mile away. It was like he was staring down a tunnel with that awful insect at the end of it, and everything else around him had gone dark. Despite it all, he managed to sputter, Can you take it somewhere else?" When she didn't move, he desperately added, "Please, just take it away." Comprehension finally dawned on Rini, and she let out a soft, "Oh." She then glanced down at the tiny creature and turned her back on Boris. "Okay, come on, Mr. Hopper, let's put you back in the grass." She gently bent over and held her hand out, palm flat. Moments later, the miniature monster hopped away and disappeared into the lawn brimming with dandelions. As soon as it left her hand, she waved and called goodbye to it. Only then did Boris's heart finally stop pounding in his chest, and he released a relieved sigh. Rini turned back to him with nothing short of concern. "Are you okay?" He was, now that disgusting thing was gone. He nodded, but was too embarrassed to look her in the eye. There came a long pause, and then she asked the question he'd been dreading. "Are you afraid of bugs?" To say he was mortified at having his worst fear revealed was an understatement, but he couldn't lie to her. His face turned beet red as he nodded again, waiting for the laughing and teasing to start. Rini did no such thing. She merely asked, "Which ones?" Boris scanned the ground for any more crawling horrors as he mumbled, "All of them." Another pause, then Rini said quietly, "You know, some of them might sting or bite, but most of them won't hurt you, not if you're nice to them." She spoke in a reassuring, comforting way, and not the mocking tone he was accustomed to from everyone else. He appreciated her sympathy, but it was still words he'd heard a million times, ones that never helped. Boris folded his arms. "I know, but I just can't help it. They got feelers and tons of legs, and they make weird noises, and they're creepy and crawly and icky and gross, and I just don't like them." He bit his lip. "Why are they even around? They don't do anything except sting and scare people. I mean, I know bees make honey, but that's the only good thing, not much else." A silence fell between them, to which Boris finally found the nerve to look at Rini, only to find she was no longer staring at him, but at something nearby. His eyes followed her gaze downward, and he then noticed a sizable anthill just a few feet away. It poked out of the grass like a tiny volcano, its microscopic residents milling in and out of it and paying the two giant kids no mind. And then, quite inexplicably, Rini developed a mischievous glint in her eye, as though she knew some profound secret and was bursting at the seams to tell Boris what it was. With an impish grin, she said, "I think bugs are a lot more important than you think. You want to see something awesome?" "Like what?" Now Boris was confused. Rini answered with her own question. "Do you trust me?" In the few days he'd known her, she'd done nothing to raise any suspicion of her intentions. Not until now, that is. Still, he gave her the benefit of the doubt and said, "I think so, yeah." She then reached over and took both of his hands in hers, their fingers intertwined. With the same ear-to-ear smile she gave him back when they first met, she wiggled her eyebrows and replied, "Then close your eyes And don't open them until I tell you. Got it? Okay, he said with bewilderment. She proceeded to shut her own eyes, her brows furrowing with a deep concentration. Boris was more than hesitant, wary as to what she was up to. He swore if she took advantage and dropped a bug on his head or down his shirt, he'd give up on trying to make friends ever again. Taking a deep breath, he let his eyes slide closed, tweeting birds and a calm wind the only sound to be heard. And he waited, and waited, and then... "Okay, you can look now," Rini chirped as she let go of his hands. Cautiously, Boris opened his eyes, expecting her to be holding some other infernal insect in her hand. He wasn't prepared to suddenly find himself in a dense forest, their bikes and the playground nowhere to be found. In utter surprise, he asked, "Where are we?" "The park," she said simply. "Yeah, but where in the park?" He glanced around befuddled, since he was sure they stood in place and never moved a single step. "How did we get here?" Whatever else he was about to say never made it to his lips, for just then there came a rustling noise next to him. He turned to see what he thought would be a squirrel or someone's dog, only to be met by the inexplicable sight of an ant. A giant, deer-sized ant! It skittered along by, carrying a berry as big as a birthday cake between its pincers. It paused to regard the two kids a moment, eyes alert and antenna twitching, before calmly moving on with its day. Heart pounding, Boris re-examined the forest they were in and the odd shape of the plants, then at long last realized they weren't surrounded by trees. It was grass, humongously large blades of grass that towered over them. And then it all clicked together. Everything else didn't get bigger. Somehow, they had gotten smaller. What happened?" Boris screamed. "Surprise! We're going on a bug adventure!" Rini excitedly clapped her hands as though nothing were wrong. Her friend, however, slowly spun in place, his jaw dropping at the impossibility he was witnessing. But how? How did we shrink?" "You just gotta imagine it." Rini spoke as if the answer were obvious and winked. "You can do just about anything if you think hard enough." Oh, Boris knew how to use his imagination. When you're someone as lonely as he once was, you learn how to escape into your mind for a while. But never did he believe such a fantasy as the one they were currently in could become reality. Not like this. And then he had another, even greater fantastical thought. If Rini could pull off magic like this, then perhaps her ghost story and all the stuff about her parents was true after all. At that point, he could fully believe anything.